Good morning. The title of my sermon today is In the Strength of the Lord, which is the title of an old hymn, and it's also a quote from the King James Version of Psalm 71, verse 16, which is a psalm written by an old man, possibly David, reflecting on the way that he's relied on God in the past and pleading with him not to abandon him in his declining years when he's facing yet another crisis. Maybe one or two of us here who can identify with that feeling. But what I really want to talk about today is confidence. Confidence, I think, is something which we would all like to have. It's something we often see in others, but if we're honest about it, we see it less often in ourselves. I would like to be more confident than I am. In fact, I've always felt like that, probably since I was a child, certainly since I was a teenager in this church. And maybe that's the experience of most people. Maybe that's what drives us to try to be good at something. You know, if we're at least good at something, singing, sport, academics, business, then there's at least one part of your life that you can feel confident with. We tend to look up to those people who appear to be confident. Sports stars, pop stars, film stars, they become our heroes and our role models. Well, not us, of course. As good Christians, all of our role models come from the Bible. I'm sure many of you, like myself, when I was a child, my parents used to read to me from this wonderful set of books, Arthur Maxwell's 10-volume series, The Bible Story, still available from all good bookshops, certainly available from the Life Source bookshop, which is just somewhere over there at the bottom of our office, £120, also available on audio CD. And so many of my heroes were drawn from this set of books, particularly the Old Testament. People like Gideon and Samson and David. And the more violent and gruesome the story, the greater my esteem for that particular hero. Gideon winning a battle against the odds, Samson killing lions and massacring people with a bit of old bone, David cutting off the head of a giant. These were strong people, confident people, people like the person I wanted to grow up to be. Looking back, though, it's probably just as well that I didn't end up like them. The demand for those particular skills is somewhat limited in today's society. But apart from that, as I learned more about the Bible, and as I read deeper into the stories of these individuals, I discovered that each of them had serious flaws in their characters. What I used to think of as their strengths were more often than not their weaknesses, flaws in their character which God had to correct and sort out before he could finally use them. And so over the years, my list of biblical heroes has changed somewhat as I discovered what true confidence really looks like. But before we come on to my chosen Old Testament hero for today, I'd like to tell you the story about something that happened when I was living in Wales, something which helped me to understand a key principle of confidence. Now, I don't like being late. It may be a coping mechanism for my lack of confidence, but I consider it to be a mark of respect, of self-discipline, and just general good manners to be on time for appointments. In fact, I probably tend to overcompensate in that regard. When I'm preaching in some far-flung district, I make sure that I arrive really early, in plenty of time. I then park around the corner and wait till about 10 minutes before Sabbath school's about to start. And then I walk in as if I've just arrived. Ironically, I'm often the first person there, But even that fact doesn't change the feeling that I have, that compulsion to be early. As I'm driving along in my car, I keep an eye on the sat-nav. And if I see that the expected time of arrival is beginning to drift from what I expect it to be, then my stress levels start to rise. Well, I was driving to Aberystwyth, which by any stretch of the imagination is a far-flung place, even when you live in Cardiff, as I did. And as usual, I allowed plenty of time. But somewhere in the wilds of West Wales, I took a wrong turning and I ended up going the wrong way down a single-track road. I kept going, looking for a place that I could turn around, but I came across a gate. And the gate was closed, and not only was it closed, it was locked. So I had no choice but to back the car up and try and reverse down this single-track lane all the way back to the road where I turned off. Now, this particular lane was overgrown on one side, and what I didn't realise was there was about a 2-foot deep ditch on that side that was overgrown. And as I was going back, you know how you sort of lean over the and you're steering with this hand looking backwards. Well, I kind of steered the wrong way. Yeah, and you know where this is going. I ended up in the ditch. Well, first thing I did was I checked the time. Still plenty of time, so no panic. I got out, I checked the damage. Damage was slight. I tried to drive out, but the front wheels wouldn't grip because all the weight was sort of on the back in the ditch. I tried to get the jack out of the car. I got the jack out of the car. I tried to get it under the car, but the car was flat down against the road, and I couldn't get the jack under the car. Got my phone out, tried to call the AA, no signal. Climbed a nearby hill. Got a signal. This is West Wales, okay? And got the AA, and they told me they would be about an hour. Now, you would expect, given what I've said, that at this point my stress levels would have gone through the roof. But in fact, the exact opposite happened. As soon as I understood that the AA were going to be an hour, all of the stress drained out of me, because I realized there was nothing I could do. The problem had been taken out of my hands and placed into the hands of somebody else. And so my stress evaporated. I got to Sabbath school. The AA man came and got me out of the ditch. I got to Sabbath school just as it was finishing, so I missed Sabbath school, but it wasn't the end of the world. I didn't lose my job, and in fact, I got an illustration for this sermon. If you go through life thinking that you have always got to have confidence in yourself, then you're going to have constant stress. There are times when you have to put your confidence in others. And if you can learn that lesson early on, then I believe you will have a much happier and a much less stressful life. If you look closely at those Old Testament heroes that I mentioned earlier, you will see this principle in action. Gideon's story in Judges chapter 7. Now, Gideon did not have a great deal of self-confidence to start with, but God gives him the task of battling the Midianites, and the fact that God trusts him with this builds his self-confidence. Well, if God thinks I can do it, then maybe I can. So he starts assembling an army, and he does a really good job. He gets 32,000 men to fight for him. Brilliant for his self-confidence. But God sees what is happening and teaches him an important lesson. You have too many, says God. What? Said Gideon. We're outnumbered by 4-1. What do you mean we've got too many? No, said God, you've got too many. Send everyone home who has a good excuse. So he did. And he was left with 10,000 men. You've still got too many, said God. What? Said Gideon. We're outnumbered now by 13.5-1. No, said God. Let's have a selection process so we only get those who are really keen. At the end of the process, poor Gideon was left with just 300 men. But that was the point. at which all the stress drained out of him. He suddenly got it. The problem had been taken out of his hands. This was nothing to do with his self-confidence. This was about having confidence in someone else, in God. Well, my second hero is Samson. We find his story in Judges 16. Miraculously blessed with phenomenal strength, Samson quickly developed a great deal of self-confidence. Too much, in fact. And like many people who are exceptionally gifted in one area, Samson believed that he must be gifted in all other areas as well. He fancied himself as a bit of a poet, and he made up poems, and I'm sure everyone told him that his poems were really good. I mean, what else would you say to Samson? He found that women were attracted to him, but he misunderstood their attraction for love, and in the end, it was his downfall. At the end of his life, blinded and in chains, Samson finally gets it. All along, his strength had been a gift, not a natural genetic characteristic. He'd never had any real grounds for self-confidence, but realizing this was a revelation to him, and the stress finally drained out of him as he looked up to heaven and put it all in God's hands. It wasn't his problem anymore. It was God's. And at that point, God took over. What a shame that Samson didn't learn that lesson earlier on in his life. Which brings me on to my Old Testament hero for today, Elisha. Now, we often think of Elisha as the prophet who followed on from the great Elijah, who was taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot. But actually, there are twice as many miracles associated with Elisha as there are with Elijah. Elisha was just a great guy. And I think the thing I really like about him is how relaxed he was about it all. I think he learned very early on that lesson which others learned only much later in life. Now, it may just be the way that the stories are recorded in 2 Kings, but Elisha seems to embody that kind of relaxed self-confidence in God that I would love to have. The first story that really appeals to me is at the end of 2 Kings chapter 2, where a crowd of rowdy boys come out of Jericho and start teasing Elisha for being bald. So Elisha calmly turns around, calls down a curse on them, and 2 bears come out of the woods and promptly beat them all up. I'm not sure why this story appeals to me, but it does. It's kind of so wrong. It's right, if you know what I mean. Probably, if we analyse the story carefully, it was a case of Elisha's life being threatened by these young teenagers, possibly, which might explain the bears. But I still like the calm way that Elisha was able to deal with it. Well, we'll jump over a few major miracles and come to what seems to be a fairly minor one in 2 Kings chapter 6. It seems that the school of the prophets wanted to build a bigger school so that Elisha could teach them more effectively. Elisha goes with them to help, and as one of the students is chopping down a tree, the axe head flies off the handle and disappears into the river. The text highlights that this was an iron axe head. The first time that iron is mentioned in the Bible is in Genesis 4, verse 22, where Tubal-Cain is noted for being a forger of bronze and iron tools. But this reference comes from the early Bronze Age, well before the discovery of iron ore extraction techniques. So scholars suggest that Tubal-Cain's raw material could have been meteoric iron, which is actually an alloy of iron and nickel. An incredibly rare and therefore very expensive commodity, possibly more expensive than gold in those days. Well, by the time we get to Elisha in the 9th century BC, Palestine has emerged from the late Bronze Age into the Iron Age. But iron is still an extremely valuable commodity because it was extremely difficult to manufacture. I've seen working examples of the ancient process that was used to extract iron. There was an outdoor demonstration at the National Museum of Wales when I was there, and it involved burning charcoal and iron ore in a short clay chimney called a bloomery, attached to a bellows mechanism. And the main challenge with making iron this way is temperature and time. You've got to get the temperature high enough, so you have to use a very high quality charcoal, and then you have to let it cook, if you like, for 48 hours with the bellows going solidly. And at the end of that process, the oxygen has been taken out of the iron ore, and you are left with a kind of spongy mass at the base of the chimney, which is called a bloom of iron ore. And you have to get that out hot, and then you have to work it manually to beat out all the molten slag. And at the end of that process, you end up with a small amount of wrought iron. But then to turn that iron into an axe head requires a great deal of work, as I know firsthand, because last year my son Dan and I went on an axe making course near Hereford. We started out with a lump of mild steel, so we bypassed all that iron ore refining process. But even starting with a lump of mild steel, it took a huge amount of effort to beat that steel into something resembling an axe head. And what you can't appreciate until you've actually tried this is the sheer amount of physical effort that is required to change the shape of the iron by just a fraction of a millimeter. You have to beat it with a great 10-pound iron-headed mallet in order to just deform it very slightly. And that's when it's glowing almost white hot. And if it gets too hot, the thing catches fire and starts burning like a sparkler, and then all your effort goes to waste. My muscles were completely shot after the first hour. Fortunately, help was on hand from the burly local blacksmiths, and it's really thanks to them that I did eventually end up with an axe, which I happen to have with me today. Bear with me. This is my axe. There we go. That's my axe. And it's, admittedly, it's not a great axe. I haven't even started work on making a proper handle for it yet. But I can tell you that this, without question, is the most expensive axe I will ever own. If you add up the cost of the course, the cost of the materials, the trip to Hereford, the hotel we stayed in, this axe cost me about £400. If that's what it cost me, think of how much the borrowed axe of 2 Kings 6 was worth. It was the iPhone 11 of its day. Losing it was a complete catastrophe for the student, and I'm sure Elisha understood this, but he was still very relaxed about it. With the student possibly in tears, Elisha cuts a twig from a nearby tree, throws it into the water, and the axe head floats to the surface. That's confidence. Not in Elisha's own abilities, but it's the kind of confidence you get from knowing God so well that you understand his character, and you understand that he's a God who cares about relatively minor things as well as the major things. I'll just put the axe back for a minute. You know, maybe that's why this story is at the beginning of 2 Kings chapter 6. Because the rest of the chapter is about a much bigger thing indeed. Israel had been under threat from the Arameans for some time, but every time there was going to be an attack, Elisha would somehow know what was going to happen, and he would give the king of Israel the heads up. And this happened so often that the king of Aram eventually found out that Elisha was to blame, and so he focused a major attack not on Israel, but on Elisha himself. It's a great story. Forgive me for taking a few liberties with the biblical account, but this is how I see it. Elisha is woken up by his servant, all in a panic, who has seen that the town where they're living is completely surrounded by Aramean horses and chariots. "Oh no, my lord, what shall we do?" says the servant. But having learned to have confidence in God, whatever the circumstances, Elisha is completely relaxed. "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And I can imagine the servant scanning the horizon, looking at the hundreds of soldiers, horses and chariots, and then back at Elisha, possibly still in his pajamas, and thinking, has he gone mad? Can't he see what I can see? At which point, Elisha yawns, stretches, looks up to heaven and says, "Lord, open his eyes." Suddenly, the servant can see what Elisha knew was there all along. Thousands of fiery horses and chariots, vastly outgoing their puny army of the Arameans. And the servant is so excited. Whooping with delight, he prepares to watch Israel's enemies being massacred. Oblivious to the hidden danger, the Arameans sound the advance and charge towards the city. But the fiery chariots don't move. "What's happening?" says the servant, starting to get nervous again. And he turns around to see Elisha kneeling on the floor. "Strike them with blindness," Elisha prays. Blindness. The servant hadn't thought of that one. Even better than a battle. Now they could all be slaughtered in cold blood. Elisha, presumably with his servants, goes out onto the battlefield and starts to talk with the now incapacitated Aramean army. "Why isn't he killing them?" thinks the servant. "You're in the wrong place," says Elisha. "As you can't see, I will take you where you need to be." And he leads the entire Aramean army to Samaria, the capital of Israel, where the king of Israel is living. "Now I get it," thinks the servant. "Why massacre them in Dothan when you can do it in Samaria, right in front of the king? This is going to be a complete humiliation." Now, the Israelite king's thinking was very much like that of the servants. The Aramean army is delivered to Samaria, totally at the mercy of the Israelites, and their eyes are opened so they themselves can understand their position. The king of Israel is so excited. He comes to Elisha and says, "Shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them?" No, said Elisha. "We're not going to kill them. We're going to feed them." "Did you say feed?" said the king. "Yes, feed," said Elisha. "Let's make them a feast and then send them home." When you have the kind of confidence that Elisha had in God, you don't need to prove anything. Unlike the superheroes of the modern film franchises, who it seems to me are always using their powers in fights and battles, when you have real confidence in someone who has real power, things can be so much more creative. God has always been more interested in winning arguments than in winning battles. We see this most clearly in the New Testament, where God limits his power so drastically that he takes on human form and allows himself to die. All to win an argument, to make a point, and to win the hearts and minds of people all over this world. We started with the old man's psalm, Psalm 71. A man reflecting on his life and achievements and realizing that in the end, the only thing that matters is your trust in God. You might have been a great warrior, a great singer, a great sports star in days gone by, but those achievements aren't going to help you when you're lying on your sickbed, cared for by other people, with little to look forward to except the resurrection to a new life. That's when you'll understand the value of true confidence. In Hebrews 11:1 and 2 we read, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." May we all develop that confidence now, so that we can live with the assurance that God will fight our battles for us, and he will take care of us, both in this world and the next. Amen.